The Writing of a County of Refuge, Refugees in Cumbria, 1933 to 1941, by Rob David. During the summer, the Cumberland and Westmoreland Antiquarian and Archaeological Society published A County of Refuge, Refugees in Cumbria, 1933 to 1941. The writing of this book was inspired by the refugee past of my family and questions associated with refugees and migrants in Britain and Europe over the past few years. Researching the situation in Cumbria in the 1930s took me along some interesting paths. A question from some of the younger members of my family about what happened to our relatives in Germany in the 1930s and their arrival in Britain as refugees revealed that we had largely lost the voices that could tell us their stories. This led me to seek out archives in Manchester where they came to live. The National Archives, which has records of the Enemy Aliens Tribunals, which my family had to attend in the autumn of 1939, and archives on the Isle of Man where some interned in 1940, resulting in the writing of a privately published book for members of my family about their experiences. While I was writing this, the news was full of the situation in the jungle camp at Calais, and that the difficulties the refugees of today were finding in negotiating our government's hostile environment policy with regards to immigration and asylum. The situation in the jungle resonated both in relation to the experiences of my family in the 1930s and because the camp included many Eritreans, some of whom may well have been students I taught in Asmara some 15 years earlier. The contemporary context further heightened any interest, and I began to wonder how Cumbria had responded to those refugees who had come to this county at the time that my father's family arrived in Manchester. This led me to the writing of A County of Refuge, Refugees in Cumbria, 1933 to 1941, which has been published this summer. Once I started looking, the evidence was everywhere. Although I began by seeking out the evidence of German and Austrian refugees, my attention was quickly diverted to the 100 or more child refugees from the Basque region of Spain who were brought to Britain at the time of the nationalist advance in northern Spain in 1937. Those who came to Cumbria were accommodated in hostels in Brampton, Carlisle, Wigton, Ambleside, and were seen throughout Cumbria as they visited communities, giving performances of traditional music and dances. The leading figure in bringing the children to Britain was Wilfred Roberts, the MP for North Cumberland. The Cumbria Archive Service Catalogue led me to another group of refugees who came from Czechoslovakia. Catherine Marshall, the famous suffragist from Keswick, was the key person here. She was involved in the Czech Refugee Trust Fund in London and welcomed 20 political refugees from Sudetenland to her house at Hawes-End. She also identified other suitable hostels for these Czechs, including one at Coldbeck, and the local History Society enabled me to meet some elderly residents who remembered the Czech community. Our hostels in South Lakeland were managed by Mary Crewston, a Kendal counsellor who welcomed the Sudeten family into her home. With the help of Kendal Oral Histories Group and surviving member of the Czech family and Mrs. Crewdson's descendants, the experiences of political refugees from Sudetenland and the role of Mary Crewston has emerged with new clarity. The discovery that Catherine Marshall was also the liaison officer whose role was to represent the enemy aliens at the tribunals held in the county in the autumn of 1939, and Mary Crewdson was her deputy, returned me to the refugees from Germany and Austria, in particular those who attended the Whitehaven Tribunal. The Catherine Marshall Archive in Carlisle Archive Centre provides an unusually extensive record of the working of this tribunal and the decision that it made. While working in Kendal Archive Centre on Mary Crewdson's background, my attention was drawn to the records of Clara Boyle. Clara was a German Jewess who married a British diplomat whose family had a house in Ambleside. In the late 1930s, Clara became central to the escape of her family members and some of their friends from Germany. One of those who came to Ambleside was her mother, Ida Ash. By chance, while reading an Ambleside oral history group recording, I discovered that Ida had taught my mother German during the war. In May 2019, I was invited to give a lecture on my family's experiences in pre-war Manchester to the Manchester Regional Group of the Jewish Genealogy Society. At the conference, my attention was drawn to an archive of various Jewish refugee organisations now held by World Jewish Relief in London. On visiting this archive, I discovered that it contained information about my family, as well as about almost every Jewish refugee who came to Britain in the 1930s, including many of those who came to live in Cumbria. These refugees connected me to refugees listed in the Catherine Marshall archive. Amongst the record, there was also material on Hilda Goldschmidt, an artist who came to live in Langdale who befriended Kurt Schwitters when he arrived as a refugee later in the war. The image on the cover of the book is a self-portrait of Goldschmidt in the collection of Lakeland Arts. My book is therefore about these refugee communities in 1930s Cumbria and the people and organisations who were instrumental in ensuring their welfare. With so many refugees living in the country, many people and voluntary organisations had a part to play in their welcome. In addition, the wider public played a significant role through charitable giving and by their interest in learning about these people and the cultures from which they came. Many refugees repaid their host communities by contributing to their economic and cultural life. The book opens with a number of refugee stories chosen to demonstrate the variety of backgrounds and experiences of those who came to Cumbria. This is followed by a chapter about the Basque child refugees. The hospitality of Cumbrians and their life in the hostels is described, as are some of the high spirits which did not always go down well with the local landowners. Many of the children remained here for the next 2 years or more. During this time, they raised money for their own maintenance by touring the country, singing and dancing in their national costume, and in doing so gave local people an opportunity to learn more about the children, Basque culture and current affairs in Spain. Local newspapers reported on such events in Carlisle, Windermere, Penrith, Kirkby Stephen, Tebay, Wigton and elsewhere. A few Jewish and political refugees began to come from Germany after the Nazis took power in 1933, and it was in 1938 that the number of Central European refugees arriving in Cumbria rapidly increased. Many were fleeing countries controlled by the Nazis or from countries in danger of being taken over. What this group had in common was its opposition to Nazism. Some were Jews, but there are also some political opponents of the Nazis amongst their number. Many Cumbrian communities welcomed those refugees by providing accommodation, friendship, and where permitted, employment. The next 3 chapters focus on significant roles played by a number of women in leading the local response to these refugees' arrival. The large numbers of refugees from Czechoslovakia found refuge in private homes such as Catherine Marshall's Horse End, as well as hostels opened in Troutbeck, Coldbeck, Patterdale and Hayton. Mary Crewdson and Catherine Marshall were instrumental in organising these refugees and supporting them as they sought to assimilate and live with their new neighbours. Many Czechs were Roman Catholic and were supported by the church. For example, Father Hill of St Catherine's Church in Penrith conducted services at Patterdale Hall for the 60 Czechs living there. The children were absorbed into local schools. The primary school at Patterdale substantially increasing in size, not only with the refugee children, but also evacuated children from the cities. The refugees at Coldbeck and Patterdale were so appreciative of the welcome they received from the local community that at Coldbeck they put on concerts, and Patterdale organised a sports and entertainment day, both of which were well reported in the local press. Hostel accommodation was not found for German and Austrian refugees. They remained more independent and often lodged with local families in communities across the county. Clara Boyle enabled some of her family members to escape from Germany, and some came to Cumbria. She also did what she could for others who needed to flee Nazism. One of the ways female Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria could acquire visas to enter Britain was through employment as domestic servants. Clara Boyle helped a friend from Germany arrive this way. Miss Emil Anderson in Keswick employed 2 Jewish sisters from Germany, Rosa and Ella Steinweg, as domestic servants, and Mrs. Nellie Rushby from Ravenglass provided sanctuary to members of a Jewish family who had fled from Austria. By 1940, a large number of refugees were settled in the county, and a chapter examines both the challenges that this brought as well as the varied contributions the refugees made. Many especially on the west coast, were employed in industries contributing to Britain's war effort. Some of these firms were Marchon, Kangol and Hornflower, themselves founded by refugees in the 1930s. Others, particularly in the Ambleside and Windermere areas, were musicians, artists and scientists, and they contributed in diverse ways to local society. When war broke out in September 1939, those refugees from Central Europe who had German and Austrian citizenship were redesignated enemy aliens and were required to attend tribunals held in a number of towns, including Barrow, Ulverston, Kendal, Penrith and Whitehaven. The tribunals is the subject of the final substantive chapter. Catherine Marshall was appointed Tribunal Liaison Officer and Mary Crewdson her deputy, and together they represented the interests of the refugees. Marshall and Crewdson were often able to take with them letters of support from individuals and organisations for the refugees, but occasionally they had to raise concerns. For example, Catherine Marshall worried about the activities of the elder Steinweg sister at Keswick, who, it was reported, spent much of her time typing letters which she feared might be to German spies lying low in communities across Britain. At the tribunals, a few of these enemy aliens were designated Category A, a threat to the country, and were immediately interned in special camps. Some were designated Category B and were placed under some restrictions. The vast majority were Category C, refugees from Nazi oppression, and could continue with their lives. The Steinweg sisters attended the Penrith Tribunal, but it seems that Catherine Marshall's fears were unfounded, as both were given Category C, like almost everyone else who attended these tribunals. At each of the tribunals held at Ulverston and Whitehaven, one person was designated Category A. At Whitehaven, something in the past of Jewish journalist Justus Shortall and his overall demeanour during the hearing concerned the panel, and after over 90 minutes of discussion, he was given Category A and immediately interned at a camp in Devon. Later in 1940, he was deported to Canada but drowned when the ship he was sailing in, SS Arandora Star, was sunk by a U-boat off Ireland. As a result of Italy entering the war on the side of Germany on June 10, 1940, Winston Churchill ordered the internment in special camps of all male enemy aliens in Categories B and C, and females in Category B, as well as all Italians living in Britain. This decision was considered unfair by many refugees and was unpopular amongst many Britons, as the Category B and C aliens were all refugees and were as anti-Nazis the rest of Britain. Many of the Italians had lived in Britain for years and regarded themselves as British. The consequence of Churchill's order was that most of the male enemy aliens in Cumbria were interned in camps, many of which were in the Isle of Man, and a few were subsequently deported. These included, for example, a German Jew from Poland, Adolf Malinov, who lived in Whitehaven, who was interned in the Isle of Man for the best part of a year before eventual release. Heinrich Hauptmann, the 17-year-old son of the highly politicised anti-Nazi Austrian housekeeper for Catherine Marshall at Hawes End, and Ernst Reichelt, a German citizen from Czechoslovakia who had been living in Maryport, who was interned and later deported to Australia. Famous refugee musicians such as the violinist Paul Adler and the music critic Hans Keller, who were living in Windermere and Ambleside area, were interned. Italians Alfredo Pieri and Giovanni Fontana were well-established businesses. What is clear from the surviving records, oral testimony and newspaper accounts is the help that most people provided for these refugees. Many found works on farms and in forestry in the Lake District. Others were employed in the hospitality industry, and yet others in new industries on the west coast. Many eventually chose to settle in the county, although others left often to live in the cities where they could be nearer people from the same background. When two refugees from Czechoslovakia departed from their lodging house in Coldbeck in 1941, they left behind a photograph of themselves on which was written, "We shall not forget you, and we hope you will not forget us." Cumbrians can be proud of what was achieved then, as the county hosts new groups of refugees in the 21st century. Copies of Rob David's book, A County of Refuge, Refugees in Cumbria 1933 to 1941, with all its fascinating information about the refugees themselves and the welcome provided by Cumbrians, are available from Ian Karuna, 10 Peter Street, Carlisle, CA3 8QP for £17. including postage and packaging. For queries, please